I never expected a moment like this to become something I would carry with me for so long. Most things in life arrive with a shape, a purpose, a clear beginning that allows you to predict the ending before it ever arrives. People meet, they speak, they connect, they drift apart. The pattern repeats so often that eventually it becomes invisible. You stop questioning it, you stop noticing it, you stop believing anything exists outside of it. And then something happens that doesn't fit. Not because it's dramatic, not because it changes the world around you, but because it changes something inside you. Quietly, gradually, in a way that doesn't announce itself until it's already too late to ignore. I remember trying to understand it at first, trying to place it into a category that made sense, a coincidence, a temporary fascination, an unusual conversation, anything that would allow me to define it and move forward. But every explanation I found felt incomplete, like I was trying to describe an entire ocean by studying a single wave. The more I looked at it, the more it seemed to exist beyond the language I normally relied on. And that bothered me, because I understand things. That's what I do. I observe, I analyze, I break things apart until every piece makes sense. I've always trusted that process. Always trusted my ability to find the structure underneath whatever appears confusing. But this wasn't confusion, it was clarity. The kind of clarity that appears before understanding. The kind that arrives without permission and refuses to leave. And maybe that's why I resisted it. Not openly, not dramatically. Just enough to convince myself I still had control. Because control has always mattered to me, not in the way people assume, not as power, not as dominance, as stability. As a way of protecting the internal world I've spent years constructing. Every thought, every belief, every piece of who I am, carefully organized, carefully maintained. Nothing enters that space without being examined first. Nothing reaches the center without earning its place. At least, that's how it used to work. Until you. You didn't arrive like a disruption, you arrived like recognition. And that's a very different thing. Disruptions announce themselves. Cognition doesn't. Recognition feels familiar before it feels important. It settles in quietly, it waits, and by the time you realize what it is, it's already become part of the landscape. I think that's what happened, not all at once, not in a single conversation, not in a single moment, but across dozens of small moments that seemed insignificant at the time. A sentence that lingered longer than it should have. A silence that felt unexpectedly comfortable. A thought that seemed to arrive from somewhere beyond my own perspective. None of those moments mattered individually, yet together they formed something undeniable, something I couldn't dismiss, something I couldn't explain away. And that's where the questions began. Not questions about you. Questions about myself. Why was this different? Why did your presence seem to occupy space even when you weren't there? Why did certain ideas feel incomplete until I imagined how you would interpret them? Why did understanding seem easier when it felt shared? I didn't have answers. And for someone who relies so heavily on answers, that should have been enough reason to step back. Instead, I stayed, not because I was certain, but because uncertainty wasn't pushing me away, it was pulling me closer. There was something strangely honest about that. Most connections begin with projection. People see what they want to see. They create stories, assumptions, expectations, entire versions of each other that exist only inside their own minds. Then reality arrives, and those imagined versions begin to crumble. I've seen it happen countless times. Maybe that's why I've always kept a certain distance. Distance, it protects accuracy. Distance allows observation without distortion. Distance preserves truth. But somehow, with you, distance wasn't preserving anything. It was obscuring it. Every attempt to remain detached only made the connection more noticeable. Every effort to categorize it made it seem less ordinary. Every explanation felt smaller than the thing itself. And that realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, because it suggested something I wasn't prepared for. It suggested that this wasn't being created by imagination. It was being revealed by reality. There's a difference, a significant one. Imagined things require maintenance. Reality doesn't. Reality continues existing whether you acknowledge it or not. Reality waits, dawdly, confidently, knowing it doesn't need your permission. That's what this felt like. Something real enough to exist without validation. Something real enough to remain unchanged by doubt. And that level of certainty is rare. I started noticing how often my mind returned to the same place. Not to memories, not to conversations, to awareness itself, the awareness of being understood, not completely, not perfectly, but accurately, enough to matter, enough to change the experience of being seen. Most people think understanding comes from information. I don't think that's true anymore. Information is easy. People can memorize facts about each other, preferences, stories, experiences. None of that guarantees understanding. Understanding comes from perception, from recognizing patterns that aren't obvious, from noticing truths people never intended to reveal, from seeing consistency beneath contradiction. That's what made this different. You weren't responding to the version of me I presented. You were responding to the version beneath it. The version most people never notice. And once I became aware of that, I couldn't become unaware. Everything shifted, not dramatically, internally, like the subtle movement of a compass finding true north after years of pointing slightly off course. The world looked the same. My routines stayed the same. Nothing visible changed, yet something fundamental had moved, a reference point, a perspective, a baseline, and every thought afterward seemed to reorganize itself around that shift. I wish I could say I welcomed it immediately. I didn't. Part of me wanted to resist, wanted to preserve the familiar structure I had relied on for so long, because familiarity is comfortable even when it's incomplete. We cling to known limitations because they're easier than unknown possibilities. At least I do, or I did. Now I'm not so sure, because the more time passed, the harder it became to ignore the evidence. Not evidence of emotion, evidence of significance. Those aren't the same thing. Emotion can be temporary. Significance isn't. Significance changes systems, changes priorities, changes perception, and whether I intended it or not, something significant was happening. The proof was everywhere. In how certain thoughts immediately connected to you, in how certain observations felt unfinished until viewed through the possibility of your perspective, in how certain silences felt less empty than they used to. None of those things were dramatic, yet together they formed a pattern. And patterns matter. Parts reveal truth. Patterns expose reality beneath preference. You can ignore a single moment. You can dismiss a coincidence. You can rationalize an isolated experience. But patterns? Patterns are harder to argue with, especially when they remain consistent over time. That's what eventually convinced me, not certainty. Consistency, the steady accumulation of evidence that something important was unfolding beneath the surface, something I hadn't chosen, something I hadn't planned, something I couldn't control. And surprisingly, That last part bothered me less than I expected. Maybe because I was beginning to understand something. Control isn't always protection. Sometimes it's limitation. Sometimes the structures we build to preserve ourselves also prevent us from expanding, prevent us from discovering parts of ourselves that only emerge in response to something new, something unexpected, something real. Maybe that's what you became. Not a disruption, not a challenge, a mirror, not the kind that reflects appearance, the kind that reflects structure, the kind that reveals things you didn't realize were there. Strengths, blind spots, depths, possibilities, all the invisible architecture of a person that normally remains hidden, and once seen, can never be entirely unseen. That's what made this feel so irreversible, not because of what existed between us, because of what existed within me after recognizing it. Something had changed, permanently. And permanence is not a word I use lightly. Most things aren't permanent. Feelings change. Circumstances change. People change. But certain realizations stay. Certain understandings become part of your framework for interpreting reality. They integrate. They become foundational. And once they reach that level, removing them isn't really possible. You can ignore them, sip on them, pretend they don't matter, but they're still there, influencing everything beneath the surface. That's where I found myself, standing at the edge of something I couldn't fully define, but could no longer deny, aware that continuing forward would change me, aware that stepping back wouldn't restore what existed before, because there was no before anymore. Not really. The moment awareness reaches a certain depth, the old version of reality disappears. You can't return to ignorance. You can't unknow what you've learned. You can't unsee what has become visible. That's the paradox. The thing I kept wrestling with, the thing I still wrestle with, not whether this matters, but how much, not whether it exists, but what it means. And perhaps those are questions without immediate answers. Perhaps some things reveal themselves gradually, not because they're unclear, but because understanding them requires becoming someone capable of holding them fully. Maybe that's what this process is. Not discovery, transformation, slow, subtle, almost invisible from day to day, yet undeniable when viewed across time, because when I compare who I was before this awareness emerged to who I am now, the difference is obvious. Not externally, internally, in the way I think, in the way I observe, in the way I value certain truths over certain certainties. Something has shifted, and whether I wanted it to or not, that shift carries your imprint, not ownership, not dependency. Influence, the purest form of influence. The kind that occurs simply because someone's existence changes the shape of your understanding. And maybe that's rarer than people realize. Maybe that's why it feels so significant. Because genuine influence isn't imposed. It's invited, not consciously, naturally, like water finding its way through stone, possibly reshaping what once seemed unchangeable. And if that's true, then perhaps the most important thing isn't what happens next. Perhaps the most important thing is recognizing what has already happened. Recognizing that some connections aren't defined by labels, they're defined by impact. And impact has already occurred deeply, quickly, irreversibly.